Hello and welcome back to Chapter 3. This is Part C, where we will talk about patterns 6 and 7. We are going to learn about intransitive and transitive verbs here, the last two types of verbs that we have to worry about. Let's go ahead and get started with a brief reminder about what's required and what is optional. So, we've been talking quite a bit so far about the required slots that any given sentence pattern has to have. In a pattern 4 sentence, for example, you have to have a subject complement. It's required. But of course, many sentences give us a lot more info than we asked for. They give us more information than what's strictly required. They love to tell us things about where and when and why and how often. Those are the verby questions that adverbials help us to answer. So when we have this kind of information in a sentence and it's not required, the way it was in pattern 1, for example, we're going to call it an optional adverbial. One of the great things about adverbs is that they are so movable. They move all over town. So optional adverbials can appear anywhere in a given sentence pattern. They are travelers. We could have a single word adverb, like suddenly or quickly or here or soon or always or sometimes, or we could have a prepositional phrase at the store, on Sunday morning, for a chat, whatever. Doesn't matter where these extremely movable optional adverbials appear in the sentence, they are always diagrammed right under the verb that they modify. So it's really simple to think about where to put them. Regardless of where they came in the sentence, they always just go under the verb. Another thing to keep in mind when we're talking about optional adverbials is that we are still going to have to try to distinguish them from adjectivals. You'll recall from Chapter 2 that any given prepositional phrase can be adverbial or adjectival depending on the context in which it appears. So the bulldog on the porch is sleeping is different than the bulldog is sleeping on the porch. Same everything. Same predicating verb, same subject, same prepositional phrase. But where the prepositional phrase is placed makes a huge difference. So we need some tips and tricks to figure out if we're dealing with an adverbial versus an adjectival. One great tip is to substitute a pronoun for the entire subject. This can help us figure out where the subject begins and ends, but it can also figure out if something is adjectival. For example, if I said, the bulldog on the porch is sleeping, I could very easily substitute the pronoun he for the entire subject, including that adjectival prepositional phrase. He is sleeping. If I tried that in the second sentence, he is sleeping on the porch. I don't get to fold the adverbial in the way I would with an adjectival. So this trick can help you avoid confusion between adverbials and adjectivals, and it can also, as I mentioned, help you figure out where the subject begins and ends, which is more complicated than it sounds sometimes. Substitute a pronoun in for the entire noun phrase. Okay. Let's practice a little bit with optional adverbials then. If I gave us the sentence, the fans were in line for the playoffs. Well, in form, we have our noun phrase. We have our predicating verb, which is be in form. In line is a prepositional phrase. And for the playoffs is also a prepositional phrase. In form, those two look exactly the same. But in function, they're going to be different. Subject is the fans, predicating verb is be, and since it's a be verb, we know we are dealing with pattern 1 or 2 or 3. So when I say the fans were in line, I am telling you required information for pattern 1. So that's an adverb of time or place. That's required. Not to be confused with for the playoffs, which is an optional adverbial. See the difference between these two? And the diagram will reflect this difference. Here are a few additional sentences for you to include in your homework. Please do form and function as well as the diagram. Okay, let's talk about one of the big reasons we're here, pattern 6. I gotta tell you, I am a huge pattern 6 fan. Pattern 6 is noun phrase, intransitive verb. That's it! Noun phrase, intransitive verb. It is a favorite because it's so simple. Why is it so simple? Because intransitive verbs are amazing. Intransitive verbs are verbs that have no complement and no adjective, no object, no nothing. So by themselves, they are very, very short when they come in sentences. The students rested. Butch growled. The magician's assistant disappeared. So they're very short. They don't have a complement. They don't have an object, nothing. Since they're so short, these pattern 6 sentences almost always have optional adverbial information that comes along with them. I'll modify those 3 previous sentences. The students rested after their long trip. Butch growled menacingly at the squirrel. The magician's assistant disappeared behind the curtain. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of intransitive verbs, so there's really no need to try to memorize them all. But there are 3 little tiny exceptions to the intransitive verb pattern. These 3 verbs, reside, sneak, and glance, you have to have an adverbial with them. You can't just say Butch glanced. You have to say Butch glanced at Cassidy. So that's a required adverbial. But those are the only 3 exceptions to the intransitive verb pattern 6. It's the only one that is an intransitive verb out of all 10 sentence patterns. Another thing that I love about pattern 6 is how beautiful and incredible its diagram is. Check out how incredible this diagram looks. Boom! It's so simple! Just the noun phrase and the intransitive verb, that's it. All those purple stars are optional. I just love this pattern. It doesn't get any simpler than that when you're diagramming sentences, and that is simplicity. That is something we will put a premium on moving forward. I've written up a few sentence 6 sentences for practice. The students work arduously. We have our noun phrase, we have our intransitive verb work, and we have an adverb, arduously. In function, we have a subject and a predicating verb. That's all we need for pattern 6. That's it. That means arduously is an optional adverbial. Here are a few additional sentences to use for practice. Form and function and diagrams, please, for your homework. There's one thing that makes pattern 6 a little sneaky, and that's intransitive phrasal verbs. Let's talk about those a bit now. We have already learned about phrasal verbs. We will recall that they are idiomatic verbs formed by a verb and a particle. This we learned about way back in chapter 12. We have already learned one great way to check if something is a phrasal verb. Can you replace it with another more precise non-phrasal verb? If so, you have a phrasal verb happening. But you can also try moving the adverb that follows the verb to the front of the sentence to see if it retains its meaning. This is a cool trick. Take the examples of we jumped up and we gave up. Could we, in fact, say up we jumped and retain grammatical meaning? I mean, yeah, it'd be weird to say it like that, but we still get what we did, which is jumped, and where we did it, which is up. But we can't say up we gave, not to retain any meaning anyway. That's got to be a phrasal verb. So that's a pretty cool thing that we can use as a trick. Try moving what looks like the particle to the front to see if you're dealing with not a particle, but an adverb instead. Now we will move on to pattern 7, the first transitive verb pattern. Noun phrase 1, transitive verb, noun phrase 2. In fact, all of the remaining 4 patterns are going to be transitive verb patterns, which is to say verbs that have direct objects. They have to have direct objects in order to be used successfully. A good example is the verb throw. You can't say simply, I threw. You have to say what you threw. I threw the ball. The ball is the direct object, the thing receiving the action of the verb. Personally, I think it's fine to think of direct objects as the thing that receives the action. This is not always technically true. There are lots of direct objects that don't actually receive the action. In the sentence, we won the game, the action is won, the game is the direct object. Can we really say, though, that the game received the action of winning? You know, not really, right? So another great way to check to see if it's a transitive verb or not is to see if the subject and the object have different reference. That's why we're saying noun phrase 1 for the subject and noun phrase 2 for the direct object. They have different reference. They're talking about different things. Of course, there's an exception here. There's an exception in many of our verb patterns. And the exception here is reflexive and reciprocal pronouns. I knew we learned about these for a reason. So, for example, if we said, Zach fed himself, or Butch and Cassidy licked each other. Himself and each other are the direct objects. They do have the same referent as the subjects, though, don't they? Himself is referring to Zach. Each other is referring to Butch and Cassidy. Technically, those aren't NP1 and NP2. They're NP1 and NP1. But we are going to go ahead and call them NP1 and NP2 anyway, even though they have the same referent, because they're still the direct object, and that's how your book would like us to do it. I am not going to start disagreeing with the book now. Let's take a look at pattern 7 diagram. I think you're going to like this. Here it is. We have noun phrase 1 as the subject. Transitive verb is the predicating verb, separated from the subject by a line that bisects the main line. And then in the direct object slot, we have NP2. You'll notice that there is a straight line, not a slanted one. A straight line indicating that here's the object, not a diagonal slanty line indicating the subject complement. So this is the diagram pattern for pattern 7. It looks like this. Of course, we have a few sentences for practice with pattern 7. Here's a pattern 7 sentence. The students read their grammar books. Okay? Well, in form, we have noun phrase 1, the students, the transitive verb read, and the transitive verb read and noun phrase 2, their grammar books. Those are what those things are in form. In function, they're the subject, the predicating verb, and the direct object. Noun phrase 2 is the direct object. And I've prepared a few more sentences for you to practice with in terms of form and function, as well as diagrams. Butch says, make sure you practice with these patterns. If you practice, if you really work at them, you can make them second nature. See you soon.